You call this a gift, a shoebox full of glue and sawdust. A real man doesn't show up empty-handed and call it humility. He shows up like this. You have been an embarrassment for longer than I can remember. Try being useful, for once, in front of people who matter. Marcus Cole's mother used to tell him that a man who explains his worth has already lost the argument. He didn't understand what she meant until he was 30 years old, kneeling on his own back lawn with sweet tea soaking through his shirt, watching his 9-year-old son push through a circle of 30 adults to reach him. By then he understood it completely. And he understood that his mother, Odessa Cole, had spent his whole childhood trying to prepare him for exactly this kind of afternoon. His name was Marcus Devin Cole. He was 41 years old, and he had grown up in a house where money was never discussed at the dinner table, even though there was plenty of it sitting quietly in accounts nobody talked about. Odessa had raised him alone after his father left, working double shifts as a hospital administrator while building a small property management business on the side, one duplex at a time. By the time Marcus finished college, that side business had become Cole Vance Holdings, a firm with stakes in warehousing, freight logistics, and commercial real estate spread across 4 states. Odessa never let the money change how she lived. She kept the same modest house until the day she died, drove a car with over 200,000 miles on it, and told Marcus more than once that the fastest way to lose yourself was to let strangers start deciding your worth for you. She died when Marcus was 26. She left him the company, a savings account he didn't touch for years out of something close to superstition, and one instruction that he carried into every relationship he built afterward. Let people love the version of you that isn't wrapped in money, because that's the only version that's real. Marcus took her instruction seriously. He expanded Cole Vance into a company worth just north of $4 billion, and he did it almost entirely out of public view. He didn't do interviews. He didn't appear at industry galas. Every acquisition ran through a holding structure with his name buried 3 layers deep in the paperwork, handled by a small executive team and one general counsel he trusted with everything. To the outside world, Marcus Cole barely existed. That distance had served him well in business. It became something far more complicated the year he met Renee Ashford. He met her at a community fundraiser, not a boardroom, wearing a jacket that was 3 years old and driving a car that had a dent in the rear bumper he'd never bothered fixing. He told her he did consulting work in logistics operations, which was, in the narrowest technical sense, not a lie. Renee was sharp, funny, and unimpressed by the things most people tried to impress her with, which was exactly why he trusted her enough to keep building a life around that half-truth. They married 2 years later. Marcus transferred the bulk of his personal holdings into a family trust structured by his attorneys so that nothing in their household, not the house, not the cars, not the furniture, reflected what he actually controlled. He told himself this was wisdom passed down from his mother. He would later understand it had also been a bet, one he had made without ever telling his wife the stakes. They had a son, Micah, and for a while the arrangement worked exactly as Marcus had hoped. Renee never once asked him to be something he wasn't. She loved that he coached Micah's youth basketball team, that he was home for dinner most nights, that he built things with his hands in the garage instead of disappearing into a phone. Marcus believed, for almost 7 years, that he had built the one thing his mother's warning had been designed to protect, a marriage that had nothing to do with money at all. The shift started with a promotion. Renee had been working in business development at Belmont and Rowe, a mid-sized commercial design and property firm that looked stable from the outside, and had, in fact, been hemorrhaging money for nearly 2 years through a string of over-leveraged renovation contracts. Cole Vance had been quietly evaluating Belmont and Rowe for a takeover for months, structured to protect the firm's staff and stabilize its debt. Marcus couldn't tell his wife any of it. The deal was under a strict confidentiality agreement, and his involvement wasn't attached to his name anywhere she could find it. So Renee climbed inside a company that was slowly failing, at the exact moment her husband was quietly deciding its future from the outside, and neither of them knew they were standing on opposite sides of the same door. That was when Preston Vale entered the picture. He was a business development director at Belmont and Rowe, the kind of man who wore a different watch every week and never let a conversation end without mentioning a deal he was closing or a client who couldn't function without him. Marcus recognized the type instantly because Cole Vance had audited a dozen companies with a Preston veil somewhere inside them. Renee, working alongside him every day, had no such advantage. Preston started appearing in small comments first, a joke Renee repeated that wasn't quite her sense of humor, an opinion about ambition that sounded borrowed rather than earned. Then he started appearing in comparisons. The car Marcus drove against the car Preston leased. The vacations they hadn't taken against the ones Preston described in the break room. A title that didn't exist yet against the modest one Marcus never corrected anyone about. Renee's mother, Corrine Ashford, had never fully warmed to Marcus. She was a woman who measured a son-in-law by the size of his ambitions on paper, and Marcus's quiet, unremarkable-looking life had always struck her as a kind of settling. When Preston's name started showing up in her daughter's conversations, Corrine didn't ask a single clarifying question. She simply recognized a story that finally matched the one she'd wanted to believe since the wedding, and she committed to it fully. Marcus watched all of it happen and said nothing, partly because Micah was watching everything too, and partly because some stubborn piece of him still believed his mother had been right, that if he waited long enough the truth about who genuinely valued him would surface on its own without him having to force it into the open with a bank statement. Belmont and Rowe's collapse accelerated faster than the acquisition timeline anticipated. Marcus's legal team, led by his longtime counsel Priya Anand, began finalizing the takeover just as Micah's 9th birthday approached. 1 week before the party, Marcus found receipts he hadn't been shown, a significant withdrawal from their shared account, a rented party company, a catering order for 40 guests. Preston Vale's name was on the guest list Renee had emailed to the venue coordinator, a copy of which had been forwarded to Marcus's own address by mistake. He didn't confront her. Instead, he went to the garage, where he had already spent 3 weekends building something for his son out of walnut and pine. A scale model of the treehouse they had sketched together the summer before complete, with a rope ladder no longer than a finger and a working little door on brass hinges. Micah had wanted to be an architect since he was 6, ever since Marcus showed him how load and support worked using nothing but popsicle sticks on the kitchen table. Inside the model's tiny attic space, Marcus tucked a folded note. "When you're 12, we build the real one, exactly to this design together." He sanded the roof one final time the night before the party and told himself he still believed in the plan his mother had given him. That belief lasted until he passed the kitchen the following evening and heard Renee and Corrine finishing a conversation rather than starting one. Corrine was telling her daughter to embarrass Marcus publicly, to make the humiliation big enough that he would walk away from the marriage without contesting anything. Renee said the papers were already drawn up. She said Preston had already promised to help her keep the house. Marcus stood in the hallway and let the conversation finish. He wasn't frozen. He was doing arithmetic. If he walked in and ended it right there, there would be no one to witness what had actually happened, only whatever account Renee chose to give afterward. But she had already invited 40 people into their backyard, 40 people who would see, with their own eyes, exactly what she was willing to do to him. He decided, standing in that hallway, that he would let the party happen. He would let every person Renee had chosen as her audience become a witness instead. By 2 o'clock the next afternoon, the backyard was full. Rented arch installations lined the fence. A hired photographer moved through the crowd, and a folding table sagged under a 3-tier cake that cost more than Marcus's actual monthly car payment. Corrine stationed herself near the drink table, accepting compliments on a party she hadn't planned as though she had built it with her own hands. And when a neighbor asked Marcus what he did for a living, Corrine answered for him before he could open his mouth. "He does something with logistics," she said, letting the pause after the word do most of the insulting for her. Preston arrived 20 minutes late, in a linen suit with no tie, timed precisely so that his entrance would land in the middle of the party rather than the start of it. He found Renee within seconds. She touched his arm, laughed at something quietly, and then said, loudly enough for the cluster of guests nearby to hear, that she genuinely didn't know how their family would have gotten through the year without him. Marcus was 8 feet away, holding a tray of lemonade glasses. No one turned to look at him. For the first hour, Preston moved through small groups of guests, repeating a story that grew more specific each time he told it. That he was about to be named vice president at Belmont, and Rowe once the acquisition closed. That the new ownership group had already signaled their confidence in him personally, that his role in stabilizing the company through the transition would be recognized at the highest level. Every detail was invented. The ownership group he described with such certainty was Cole Vance Holdings. The confidence he claimed to have earned belonged to a company Marcus already controlled. Micah felt the tension before anyone said a word about it. He found his father twice in the first hour, slipping a small hand into his without explanation, and the second time he looked up and asked quietly if everything was okay. Marcus told him it was fine and asked if he was having a good birthday. Micah said kind of, and Marcus told him that was an honest answer, and that honest answers were always allowed in their house. Gift opening started at 3. Renee had arranged the guests in a wide circle around Micah, with the same instinct for visibility that had shaped the rest of the afternoon. Several phones already raised before the first box was even unwrapped. Marcus stood at the edge of the circle, holding the walnut treehouse model in both hands. Micah recognized it the second he saw it, not because it looked expensive, but because he remembered every Saturday spent drawing the blueprint at the kitchen table. He reached out and took it carefully, the way a person holds something they already understand the weight of. Renee stepped forward and pulled it out of his grip in one motion. She held it up in front of the circle, examined it with open contempt, and let it drop onto the grass. "You call this a gift? A shoebox full of glue and sawdust?" Her voice carried across the entire yard without needing to rise. Micah stood very still, staring down at the model on the ground, and the circle around him went quiet. Kareen moved in behind Marcus and gripped both his shoulders, hard enough that it was clearly not spontaneous. Preston stepped forward with a small velvet box already prepared, opened it toward Micah, and revealed a men's watch far too large and far too expensive for a 9-year-old's wrist. "A real man doesn't show up empty-handed and call it humility," Preston said in the calm, reasonable tone people use when they want cruelty to sound like generosity. "He shows up like this." A handful of guests laughed, not the whole yard but enough of it. Micah didn't reach for the watch. He walked around Preston, knelt in the grass, and picked up the broken treehouse model himself, holding it flat against his chest. Then he turned to his mother and asked, in a voice steadier than anyone expected from a 9-year-old, why she had done that to his father's gift. The yard went completely still. Something about a child asking the question every adult in the circle had been too polite to ask cut straight through the noise of the afternoon. Renee's expression shifted from satisfaction to irritation. "Micah, put that down and go stand with Preston for the pictures." Micah shook his head and held the broken model tighter against his chest. Marcus stepped forward and kept his voice low. "Renee, don't do this to him on his birthday." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see his calm being read as weakness, confirming whatever story she had spent the last year building about him in her mind. She glanced at Preston, then back at Marcus. "You have been an embarrassment for longer than I can remember," she said, almost gently. "Try being useful, for once, in front of people who matter." Kareen's grip tightened on his shoulders as Renee reached for the pitcher of sweet tea sitting on the gift table. Marcus made a deliberate choice not to pull away, understanding that resisting in front of 40 witnesses and his own son would shift the story from what she had done to what he had done in response. Renee tipped the pitcher over his head. Cold tea soaked through his hair, his collar, and down the back of his shirt, and for half a second the entire yard fell into a silence sharp enough to hear the ice cubes hit the grass. Kareen laughed first, loud and open, and Preston joined her a beat later. The sound spread unevenly through parts of the crowd, the way group laughter spreads when people aren't sure they should participate but follow whoever seems most confident. Renee held the empty pitcher a moment longer than necessary, making sure the point had landed. Marcus straightened slowly, didn't wipe his face, didn't raise his voice, and gave no one in that yard a reason to remember the moment as anything other than exactly what it was. Then Micah was beside him, crying hard, using his own sleeve to wipe the tea from his father's eyes with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, asking over and over why his mother had done that. Marcus crouched down, wiped his son's face first, then his own, and told him he didn't owe anyone an apology for something that had never been his fault. Renee produced an envelope from a bag near the gift table and set it on top of the ruined cake. "This marriage is over," she said. "Sign it tonight and be out of the house by morning." Marcus looked at the papers, then at her. "Is this really what you want?" He asked, not as a plea but as a final, deliberate confirmation in front of every witness that she was choosing this clearly, with nothing forced. She didn't answer in words. She picked up a pen, signed her line, and held the pen out to him. He signed beneath her signature. Corrine stepped forward with a pen she had clearly brought from home, a detail that told Marcus exactly how long this moment had been planned, and signed the witness line with visible satisfaction. "Finally," she said, loud enough for the circle to hear, "my daughter is free." What none of them knew was the report Priya had sent him 3 days earlier. The Cole Vance forensic accounting team, deep in due diligence on the Belmont and Rowe acquisition, had traced 18 months of falsified vendor invoices routed through shell accounts Preston personally controlled, along with corporate card charges, including a designer handbag and 2 vacation deposits gifted to Renee, totaling well past $200,000. Buried further in the audit trail were 4 instances where entries had been deleted using access credentials assigned to Renee's employee login. Whether she had understood what she was approving was still genuinely unclear. Her access, however, was not. There was one more detail neither Renee nor Corrine had accounted for. The house had never been a marital asset. It sat entirely inside the Cole family trust, and Renee's right to occupy it had always been contingent on the marriage remaining legally intact. She had just signed the papers that ended it. Marcus said none of this in the backyard. Priya had already warned him what disclosing his identity in that exact moment would look like to a family court. A wealthy husband using financial leverage to strong-arm a wife who simply wanted out. The papers needed to finish their natural legal sequence, and the decision needed to remain entirely hers on paper. But it wasn't the legal strategy that kept him quiet in that moment. It was Micah, who had already absorbed more of that afternoon than any child should have to, and who did not need his father turning the rest of his birthday into something louder. Renee nodded toward 2 men stationed near the side gate, private security she had arranged before the party even started, a detail that told Marcus exactly how far in advance this had all been staged. They asked him, politely, to gather his things. He went inside, retrieved a bag he had quietly packed that morning, and walked back through the yard past guests who suddenly found it very difficult to hold his gaze. He bent down on his way out, and picked up the snapped-off roof piece Corrine had crushed underfoot without seeming to notice. Micah caught him at the front door and wrapped both arms around his legs, refusing to let go, saying he didn't want the watch, he didn't want any of it. He just wanted to keep the broken treehouse, and he wanted his father to stay. Marcus knelt down on the porch, tea still drying in his hair, and held his son's face in both hands. "I'm not leaving you," he said. "I'm leaving a house where the adults forgot how to treat each other. Those aren't the same thing." Corrine pulled Micah back inside by the arm before he could answer, and the door closed. Marcus spent that night in a hotel 11 blocks from the house he had built, sitting at a desk by the window with a cup of coffee he never drank, reading through the final acquisition documents one more time. By 8 the next morning, Cole Vance Holdings would officially own Belmont and Rowe, and its employees would be gathered in the main conference room to meet their new ownership for the first time. He called Priya just before midnight to confirm everything was in order. She asked how Micah was doing. Marcus told her a neighbor had quietly checked in on him and reported that he'd placed the broken treehouse on his nightstand and refused to let anyone touch it. Priya asked how Marcus was doing. He told her to ask him again tomorrow. The Belmont and Rowe conference room was full by 8:15 the next morning. Staff gathered under a company-wide notice that had gone out days earlier, announcing a mandatory meeting about new ownership. Marcus had approved that notice himself. He waited in a side corridor with Priya and two members of his legal team while the room filled, catching fragments of Preston's voice through the wall, still confidently narrating a promotion that had never actually been offered to him by anyone. At 8:30, the outgoing chairman opened the meeting and welcomed the new owner to the podium. Marcus walked in without hurrying. The room registered him in stages. First the people near the front who could see his face clearly, then the screen behind him lighting up with the Cole Vance Holdings logo, his name listed as founding principal beneath a summary of the completed transaction. Preston was seated in the third row. Marcus watched the exact second recognition landed. The man whose face had been soaked in cold tea 48 hours earlier, in front of 40 witnesses Preston himself had helped assemble, was now standing at the podium as his new employer. It wasn't a collapse. It was a slower, colder rearrangement behind his eyes. Renee sat closer to the middle of the room, dressed for a promotion she believed was still coming. When the slide naming Marcus as founding principal appeared, she went still for a long moment, visibly working backward through the house, the trust, the papers she had signed 2 nights earlier, watching each piece land somewhere she hadn't expected. Corrine, seated near the back as what she likely considered moral support, looked at the screen, then at Marcus, then back at the screen, as though waiting for someone to correct an obvious clerical error. No one did. Marcus introduced himself to the staff without theater, telling them plainly that the acquisition had been driven by the strength of their work, not the leadership currently sitting above them, and that anyone in good standing would receive written confirmation of their position within the week. Then he nodded to Priya, who connected her laptop to the display. What appeared was methodical: 18 months of falsified vendor transactions, shell accounts under Preston's control, corporate charges traced to gifts given to Renee, and finally the access logs, the specific employee credentials used to approve and later delete the entries. Renee's login appeared 4 separate times. People in the room began turning in their seats. Preston stood before anyone addressed him directly, already delivering a version he had clearly rehearsed on the drive in, that the transactions had run through Renee's system access on his instruction, framed to her as routine interdepartmental accounting, and that she hadn't understood what she was actually approving. He said it smoothly, the way people speak when self-preservation has already outpaced loyalty. Renee turned and looked at him. In the space of a few seconds, she had to absorb not just that he was cutting her loose in front of her colleagues, but that he had clearly planned to do it from the very beginning, positioning her directly in the path of whatever consequences eventually arrived. She had traded a husband who had never once used his position against her for a man who had just made her his exit plan in a room full of witnesses. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Priya then walked the room through the property documentation, explaining without embellishment that the residence listed under Renee's name had always belonged to the Cole family trust, and that her right to occupy it had been contractually tied to the continuation of the marriage. She noted the date on the divorce filing. She noted the signatures and their witness. From the back of the room, Corrine insisted the house was in her daughter's name, that this had to be a mistake. Priya calmly clarified that the occupancy agreement carried Renee's name. The title never had. Corrine looked around the room, waiting for someone to contradict this, and when no one did, she sat down slowly, understanding piece by piece the full shape of what she had just helped orchestrate. Renee asked, quietly, if she could speak with Marcus privately. He told her this wasn't the setting for that conversation, that the legal process would handle what needed handling, and that was the only statement he intended to make in that room. He meant it. Whatever anger he carried out of that backyard belonged somewhere private, not on display for her former coworkers, because the way he carried himself from that point forward was the version of their father Micah would eventually have to make sense of. Preston was suspended before he left the building, and formally charged 3 weeks later with wire fraud and falsification of corporate records. Under deposition, he admitted his relationship with Renee had been calculated from the start, built around the access her position provided him rather than any genuine feeling. Renee lost her job at Belmont and Rowe, because she cooperated fully with investigators, and her direct knowledge of the fraud remained genuinely ambiguous. She was never charged. Though she lost her professional standing, along with the house, and the future she had spent the better part of a year quietly building around Preston. The family court proceedings moved quickly given the volume of evidence: 3 separate phone recordings from guests at the party, several written statements, and a documented pattern of Preston being positioned in front of Micah as a replacement father figure. Primary custody went to Marcus. Renee received scheduled visitation on the condition that Corrine not be present during those visits, and that nothing negative be said about Marcus in Micah's presence. Marcus never asked the court to remove Renee from their son's life. He only asked that the people around Micah meet a basic standard of conduct, and that was the only thing he pushed for. He and Micah settled into a smaller, quieter house a few months later. Micah picked his own room and asked if they could frame the original hand-drawn blueprint from when he was 6 and hang it above his desk, which Marcus had done the following weekend. They repaired the treehouse model together on a Saturday afternoon at the new kitchen table, gluing the cracked roof piece back along its fracture line, instead of replacing it, and Micah decided out loud that it looked better that way, like something that had actually survived a thing worth surviving. On the morning of Micah's 10th birthday, Marcus drove him to a wooded lot Cole Vance had quietly purchased months earlier behind a youth architecture and design program, the company funded for kids from underserved neighborhoods. Micah didn't know any of that context. He only knew they were going somewhere and that his father had told him to wear old sneakers. In a small clearing stood the beginning frame of a real treehouse, built to the exact proportions of their original kitchen table blueprint, cream-colored railing and all. On the little landing platform sat the repaired walnut model, cracked roof facing outward. Micah stood in front of it for a long moment before turning around with the look of someone trying very hard not to cry about something that deserved to be cried about. "You remembered," he said. "I wrote it down," Marcus told him. "I keep what I promise." Renee was there too, at a distance, having asked days earlier if she could come, and Marcus had agreed after thinking it over. She stood near the tree line in plain clothes, no jewelry, nothing announcing itself. When Micah noticed her, he was quiet for a moment, then walked over on his own. She knelt down and told him she was sorry for the treehouse, for the party, for every choice that year that had cost him more than it should have. She told him she had confused what things cost with what they were actually worth, and that it had taken losing nearly everything to understand the difference. Micah listened to all of it, then said, simply, "Okay," not full forgiveness, but an acknowledgement that the words had been said and that he was willing to let them exist between them. He asked if she wanted to see the frame going up. She said yes, and the 3 of them stood together at the edge of the clearing, looking at something that had started as a sketch at a kitchen table and had somehow survived everything that came after it. Driving home that evening, Micah asked why his father hadn't told anyone about the company sooner. Marcus thought about it before answering, the same way he thought through everything that mattered. He told his son that he had believed, for a long time, that hiding it was the only way to find out what people truly felt underneath everything else. Micah asked if it worked. Marcus said it showed him the truth eventually, but admitted he probably could have trusted what he was already seeing far earlier, instead of waiting on a test to confirm something his instincts had already told him. Micah nodded slowly, filing it away the way children do, with things they're not ready to fully use yet, but know they'll need later. What stays with Marcus, more than the boardroom, more than the acquisition, more than watching Preston's face rearrange itself in real time, is his son at 9 years old, wiping cold tea from his father's eyes while 40 adults stood and did nothing. Children rarely measure a person by a title or a number in an account. They measure whether someone showed up, whether they kept their word, and whether they stayed steady when everything around them wasn't. The crack in the treehouse roof is still visible if you look for it. It always will be. But the roof holds, the frame is going up exactly to plan, and some Saturdays, if you drive past that clearing, you can still hear a 9-year-old's laughter carrying through the trees, unbothered by any of it.